Imagine you wake up in a house that's not yours. This is no Airbnb, no visit with a friend. Actually, it's a house you just bought. A house where a man named George once lived and died and left behind everything. Not just furniture, not just clothes, dishes, and cooking gadgets, but books. Hundreds of books. They weren't just the random clutter of someone who was stockpiling books. Anyone can accumulate them. You buy one, someone gives you another one, you inherit a box from an uncle, you never get around to donating them. You just pile on these symbols of literacy, and eventually they become chaos, masquerading as personality or intelligence. This wasn't that. This was a selection, a narrowing, a funnel of intrigue. The books laid out a map, a code, a window into the mind of a man who, even in death, is still communicating a thought pattern. George's worldview is here. It was stacked shelf by shelf, books about types of spirituality that included the paranormal, working outside the boundaries of time and space. And space, in this instance, includes UFOs. It includes books about power, about secrecy, about magic, about America, about collapse. I think I may have stumbled upon a new genre of ghost story, one where a house is not so much haunted as it's trying to communicate with me. In our previous episodes of I'm Curious About George, I introduced you to a strange house on a hill filled with the entire contents of another person's life. The bookshelves stacked with volumes on the occult, psychic phenomena, magic, religion, and even stranger things. I shared my lifelong attraction to buildings that hold lingering histories, from the Huron substation in Los Angeles to the first home I purchased, which happened to have housed a gay porn film production company. And I introduced you to the conundrum I call Falcon Man, an image, a guide, a messenger that appeared in my meditations the moment I encountered this property. The objects contained within this house triggered a childlike wonder with archaeology and exploration. I mused upon the emergence of global consciousness, the study of telepathy, and the implications of remote viewing and UAPs. I also delve into the rapid advancements in AI and the shifting perceptions of religion, ultimately reflecting on how future generations may interpret our current societal artifacts. Was Falcon Man guiding me to land on this land? Or was he guiding me to something else? Sometimes the past taps you on the shoulder, sometimes it grabs you by the hand, and sometimes it sends a messenger. My name is Micah Kopp, and I'm the creator and host of I'm Curious About George. Welcome to episode 3, when curiosity turns into something else entirely, a podcast, actually. One's library of books can say so much about who you are. A great example is the musician David Bowie, who in 2013 published a list of 100 books that influenced his lyrics, his creative outlook, and his life. I won't name all 100, but I'll name a few. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels, On the Road by Jack Kerouac, and The Life and Times of Little Richard by Charles White. So interesting. Supposedly, former President Richard Nixon preferred to read Tolstoy, while former President Ronald Reagan regularly read Tom Clancy novels. Who knew? As you know, there were over 1,000 books in George's library, and the library had a number of specific themes, many of which you already know, and I'll repeat: the occult, psychic phenomena, UFOs, mediumship, spiritualism, and politics. In addition, George had achieved a PhD in divinity and had many books on the history of religion and Christianity on his bookshelves. While the religious texts can be their own rabbit hole of information, and obviously they're open to many interpretations, reactions, and potential dogma, I felt it would be better to assume religion and Christianity to be the primed canvas of our exploration into the other themes of George's library. Today, we're going to walk through just some of those books. And I want you to imagine not just the words on the page, but what they mean about the man who collected them, kept them, and lived with them as his close company. When I bought this house, I thought I was inheriting objects, perhaps disposable, the debris of someone else's life. But slowly, something else emerged, a pattern. These books weren't random. They weren't eclectic. They were focused. These books were being read way before some of the common themes in today's headlines, such as authoritarianism, fading democracy, UFO disclosures, Russian influence over world elections, etc. What George seemed to be studying wasn't the future. It was the approach of something big. And standing alone in the house, surrounded by these shelves, I felt something unsettling. Not like I was discovering a secret, but like I was arriving late to a conversation. Do you know who had a library eerily similar to this one? Harry Houdini, the magician, the escape artist, the obsessive collector of books on magic, spiritualism, secret societies, and the occult. Houdini didn't just perform illusions. He studied belief itself, what makes people believe, what makes people follow, what makes people surrender reason. So let's begin with magic. What I started to realize is that magic and religion aren't necessarily opposites. They're cousins. Both attempt to connect with divine or unseen forces. In religion, that connection might happen through prayer. In magic, it might happen through a spell or an incantation. Some people will tell you one is holy and the other is evil. My response to that is super simple. Any system, religious or magical, that tries to influence the natural direction of things without considering the best outcome for all, that to me is potentially evil. On George's shelves, I counted nearly 20 books on magic. That's a lot. Too much for one episode. So I focused on a few that seemed to speak to each other across the room. Codex Magica by Tex Mars, The Complete Golden Dawn System of Magic by Israel Regardie, and Raphael's Ancient Manuscript of Talismanic Magic. Let me pause for a second just to appreciate the physical reality of these books. Two of them are massive, dense, overwhelming. The Golden Dawn literally weighs about 5.8 pounds, almost 6 pounds of ritual instructions, symbolic systems, and ceremonial complexity. Codex Magica comes in lighter at a modest 3.4 pounds of what can only be described of paranoid intensity. And then there's Raphael's book, Thin, Dark, Quiet, the kind of book that feels like it's whispering instead of shouting. The Golden Dawn system is academic, structured, and old. It traces its roots back to Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. It incorporates tarot, Kabbalah's tree of life, Enochian magic, and even a chessboard-like system for what looked like spiritual warfare. This is magic as hierarchy, magic as system, magic as discipline. Codex Magica is something else entirely. It's not scholarly, it's conspiratorial. It reads like a manual for decoding a hidden war. Page after page of images claiming to reveal a satanic elite operating in plain sight. Politicians, celebrities, powerful figures allegedly exposing themselves through symbols and hand gestures. This book fixates on one symbol in particular, the horned hand sign, a gesture said to be associated with the devil for over 2,500 years. Unfortunately and dangerously, it also closely resembles the American Sign Language sign for I love you, which, for the record, I love you guys. Heavy metal culture adopted this. Sports teams adopted this. Popular culture adopted this. Why? Why does everyone use this sign? According to Codex Magica, it's how you identify members of the Illuminati hiding in photographs. It's entertaining, it's unsettling, and it sits uncomfortably close to modern conspiracy thinking, QAnon, elite cabals, the mythology of power operating beyond accountability. What does that remind me of? And now we're living in a world where Jeffrey Epstein had ties that reach into Russia and Israel, where things that many of us, including me, would have shrugged off years ago as conspiracy theories. And now they sit uncomfortably close to documented reality. And then there's one more book that I want to add to this group, written by Annie Besant, who's well known in this area. And it's called Thought Forms. The book proposes something radical, that thoughts aren't abstract. They're shapes, structures, forms that persist beyond the mind that creates them. That intrigued me, because what if George wasn't trying to predict events? What if he was recognizing collective thought patterns as they solidified in real time? What if the future isn't foretold, but slowly constructed? I think we have to explore where these ideas take us, because so much of what is happening today is simply unbelievable. And so much of what I found in George's house exists right at that edge, that place where curiosity turns dangerous and where belief begins to shape the world itself. One of the first books I picked up was titled A Dark History of Russia by Michael Kerrigan. It's the kind of book you might find in a used bookstore's history section. Heavy, detailed, the immense cost of Russia's extremes over centuries. A catalog of violence, purges, secret police, corruption, royalty, oligarchs, and dictators. What was George's interest here? In Russian czars, in Stalin, gulags, or was it more recent history, like the involvement of Russian intelligence in U.S. elections? Was he just a history buff, or was he looking for patterns, signs of authoritarian shadows creeping across our own present? Also in this library is Naomi Wolf's The End of America. It was published in 2007, almost 20 years ago, at which time many people dismissed it as alarmist. She outlined 10 early warning signs of democratic collapse, not coups or tanks in the street, but quieter shifts. The book is about how democracies die, how freedom slips away step by step. I'll just show you this book. It's kind of unbelievable. If a dark history of Russia is a past already written, the end of America is a future we might already be living. It's almost prophetic. Taken together, these two books feel like a warning, a kind of preparation. And then, of course, within the same subject area on the shelves was the Mueller report. It's not occult. It's not mystical. It doesn't glow. It sits there, thick and bureaucratic, bound like a government phone book, wedged between texts on intelligence agencies and books about hidden systems of power. And that's when it hits me. This is an occult text, not in the way we usually mean, but in the original sense of the word, occultist, hidden, obscured, buried under language so dense it functions as camouflage. The Mueller report documents interference without consequence, evidence without action, knowledge without transformation. Page after page, describing something enormous and then carefully refusing to name it. George owns this. He chose to keep it, likely not because it was entertaining, because it's not, but because it represents a moment when America saw something and collectively decided not to act. The Mueller report doesn't sit alone. It's surrounded by books on secret architecture, shadow governments, military research programs, intelligence failures, psychological operations. And years ago, I would have said this is complete paranoia, but now it sort of feels like pattern recognition. George wasn't collecting conspiracy theories. He was collecting mechanisms, ways systems protect themselves, even when exposed. Reading the report now, years later, something else becomes clear. The real story isn't what happened, it's what didn't. And suddenly, the occult books on the shelf feel less fringe than the government ones. I start to understand George not as a believer, but kind of as a witness, someone who lived through Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11, Iraq, Snowden, and saw some of these same patterns repeat. And then, as I continue to scan past the books about Russia and democracy, another title beckons, Blackwater by Jeremy Scahill. It's an expose on private military companies, mercenary armies, essentially. Invisible armies fighting wars for profit. It's about what happens when violence becomes a service you can hire, when accountability gets subcontracted along with the killing. Scahill documents how Blackwater and other private military companies operated in the shadows of official power, funded by the state, protected by contracts, and insulated from consequences. Reading it years after its publication, I realized it isn't just about mercenaries overseas. It's about a system learning how to act without being seen, how to create force that answers to no public, no visible chain of command. Blackwater isn't a scandal. It's a blueprint for power that survives exposure by fragmenting responsibility until no one can be held. Blackwater was founded by Eric Prince, who has sold and rebranded his service multiple times, currently resurrected and operated under a new name, Vectus Global. If you trace the line, Russia's shadowy history, the decline of American democracy, the rise of corporate armies, George seemed to be mapping systems of power. And it feels timely to read some of these books while armies of ICE officers are terrorizing and killing our citizens. And National Guardsmen, in certain instances, have been weaponized as private armies in specific American cities. I know this is all very heavy, But the timing of all of this feels so prevalent. And then came Jeff Charlotte's The Family. If you don't know it, The Family is fiction, as in real, about a secretive Christian organization with great influence in Washington, D.C. Charlotte writes about a quiet, deeply influential Christian network embedded in American politics. Not loud, not televangelist style, but intimate. Prayer breakfasts, private meetings, the language of humility used to shield enormous power, where faith and secrecy mirror each other, a way to claim moral legitimacy without public scrutiny. The Family really isn't about religion. It's about how power prefers to move quietly, wrapped in language that discourages questioning. It fits perfectly with the other books on these shelves, systems that don't announce themselves but endure. George seemed to be stitching together a portrait of states, of armies, of religion, all as engines of control. But here's the question. Did he see himself as a detective uncovering the truth? Because from here, the shelves get a little stranger. There's The House of Trump, House of Putin by Craig Unger, a book about financial entanglement, influence, compromise. The book traces financial entanglements, influence networks, and the long, quiet relationship between American capital and Russian oligarchy. What mattered to me wasn't any single allegation. It was, again, on patterns. Reading this in context of George's library, it became clear that he wasn't interested in scandal. He was studying all these alignments, how money, secrecy, and leverage travel easily across borders, even when values supposedly don't. This book sits in George's collection like a bridge between histories, reinforcing the idea that authoritarianism doesn't arrive as an invasion. It arrives as familiarity, as business, as something that already knows how to speak our language. It arrives while getting coffee at a cafe or being in a supermarket. A lot of these books now seem more obvious, but reading them then, years ago, meant standing outside the mainstream and staying there. The shelves start to talk to each other. The Mueller report doesn't sit alone. It's surrounded by books on secret architecture, shadow governments, military research programs, intelligence failures, and psychological operations. George seemed deeply interested in how power conceals itself, not just politically, but symbolically. The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital by David Oveson argues that Washington, D.C. isn't just a political center, it's a symbolic one, laid out according to esoteric principles, Masonic geometry, sight lines, and intentional alignments that encode power into the landscape itself. It occurred to me that the East Wing of the White House has been demolished in preparation of a new version of the East Wing. In 1793, George Washington oversaw the laying of a cornerstone at the southeast corner of the original White House using a silver trowel and Masonic rituals. Despite numerous renovations, it has yet to be located and remains a mystery. I'm wondering if during the current renovation of the East Wing, if they're seeking that special Masonic cornerstone laid by George Washington. It implies that power doesn't necessarily reside in laws or leaders, but can embed itself into places. Streets, buildings, monuments become messages that outlast the people who design them. Oveson isn't asking you to believe in superstition. He's asking you to notice intention. And in the context of this house, that ideal feels less theoretical. Perhaps George believed that architecture, like ritual, continues to speak after its builders are gone. Paired with secret places, hidden sanctuaries, the message is subtle but clear. Power does not like to be obvious. This book isn't about one city or one ideology. It's about the human instinct to create spaces that conceal meaning. Hidden rooms, sacred sites disguised as ordinary structures, places designed to be found only by those who know how to look. Reading it alongside the others, I began to see how perfectly it fit George's worldview. Power, belief, and memory don't disappear, they withdraw. They move into sanctuaries, both physical and conceptual. Secret Places isn't about escape, it's about continuity, about how what matters is often protected by invisibility. Standing in this house, whose windows were salvaged from the original Lockheed Martin Skunk Works factory, I started to feel how deeply this idea might have resonated with George's thinking. I wonder if places like people retain memory. Oveson suggests power hides in plain sight, encoded into streets, monuments, sightlines. Maybe George believed architecture could communicate, or maybe he believed it was already doing so. Maybe this architecture is communicating to me. And remember, these books were read almost a decade ago or longer. And now onto the most taboo of subjects: Satan, demons, and paranoia. Wow, that's a mouthful. As I said earlier, these are just a few books taken within the backdrop of George's deep religious education, and I found not one but two copies of Elaine Pagel's The Origin of Satan. Pagels is a respected religious historian. She doesn't write horror, she writes analysis, tracing how early Christians created the figure of Satan as a way of defining outsiders. Pagel traces how societies externalize fear, creating things such as enemies, devils, and others when internal contradictions become unbearable. That book reframed everything for me. What if George believed America wasn't becoming evil, but just frightened? And fear often needs a shape, a name, a tangible target. The book is thoughtful, scholarly, and as with all of this information in these books, food for thought. But in George's library, surrounded by talismanic magic and tarot cards, it feels like part of a darker equation. And then, like a ghost from the aerospace industry, another book, Skunk Works by Ben Rich. It's about the top secret division of Lockheed Martin, the one that built stealth bombers and spy planes, the kind of projects hidden from the public for decades. You know, where my windows come from. I'll admit, this is intense. The glass that once looked out over classified projects and planes now looks out from George's windows. I mean, my windows, onto not planes, but birds soaring past the house. It's almost as if this house itself was an extension of the library, a fusion of secret histories, psychic experiments, magical manuals, or political exposés. And let me just throw one last book in here for episode 3, because there's going to be episode 4, and I'll tell you what that's about in a second. There's a book here called There Are No Accidents, Synchronicity, and the Stories of Our Lives. I mean, that's almost funny. It's about synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. I don't know if I believe that there are no accidents, but I do know this. The longer I live in this house, the more often the books I needed seem to appear. And when I close my eyes and try to imagine George, I don't see a man casually thumbing through paperbacks. Nothing here feels casual. I see a man tracing lines of power from Moscow to Washington, from churches to mercenary armies, from tarot decks to Skunk Works military technology. He wasn't collecting books, he was collecting and building a worldview where nothing is as it seems, where symbols hide meanings, where history is a warning, where magic and politics bleed into each other. There is George's apparent worldview, and then there's George's spiritual view, which seems to combine with the paranormal. And that view very much emphasizes that the boundaries between the earthly and the divine, or those alive or in spirit, may be manufactured by a society that doesn't see the true full spectrum of possibility. George clearly felt that there was a communication beyond death. Well, and how odd that I should arrive in such a house, in such a place, and feel compelled to share the story of George, a man I never met and who is no longer living. Does that mean that George's theories were true and now proven? Standing alone in the house, surrounded by these titles, I feel a quiet pressure, like something asking me to pay closer attention. When George read these books, they weren't controversial. They were marginal. Warnings whispered, not debated at dinner parties or on cable news. I felt a chilling realization how many of these arguments are now settled facts. This house is full of secrets, some beautiful, some heavy, some still unfolding. And the more I explore, the more I realize this isn't just a house, it's a map of a life with clues, coded messages, and artifacts that feel ritualistic, purposeful. The longer I stay in this house, the more I feel like George's questions are becoming my own. Could this be a paranormal fairy tale? I say that playfully, but it fits. There's a magical beast in the form of a messenger falcon. There are treasures and riddles. There is loss and loneliness and guidance. There are signs pointing in every direction, including back toward myself. Do you hear that sound? That's the sound of my cuckoo clock telling me it's time to end episode 3. My name is Micah Kopp, and I am the creator and host of I'm Curious About George. I ask that you subscribe to this channel. If you don't, it'll remain invisible to the algorithms that introduce this content to everyone. Tune in to episode 4, where we'll dive deeper into George's library, into the mediums and psychic guides who were seers of the future, such as Edgar Cayce. And we'll ask, did George ever find what he was looking for?